Hi, welcome to video number 2. This is the second part of the best beginning practices for tarot readers. I started this series as a way to answer a lot of questions and address a lot of concerns that beginning readers often have. I know that I had them when I was a beginning reader as well. And the advice that I'm giving in these series is just a compilation of a lot of the advice I was given along the way. So, passing that along. Okay, so today's subject is specific to tarot journals and to daily draws. Okay, what are we talking about? The last video, which if you haven't seen, that one we talk about journaling at the very beginning of it, and I mention the importance of journaling. And then we move into the rest of the discussion, which was really talking about all of my awesome books here in my library as recommendations for other esoteric library like you might be building. Okay, but today I specifically wanted to talk about journals because that was something that I didn't get to until the advice that I'm giving today came very late in my tarot career. I started out as a reader. I bought my first deck at the age of 25, and for the first 5 years or so, I just kind of messed around with my deck. I played with it. I used the little white book, the little LWB is how it's even abbreviated by a lot of advanced tarot readers. So the little white book and its keyword meanings, and I made things up and I just looked at the cards and was very freeform about it. And that's an approach that some people do take if they just buy a deck of cards and they want to get started, and they start with the first scholarly influence they have, which is the little white book. So that was my path, but what I was given later as advice, and for me I wish it would have come earlier, was the idea that journaling is actually really important. And as a librarian, as a person who loves books, I did not give any value to the concept that I could write something about my impressions of the cards that I was working with, and that would mean something. I completely believed that the only right way to do tarot reading was to memorize all of the prescribed meanings of these 78 cards and then be able to process that information to answer a question, right? But people later who had years of experience told me there's a better approach. And I didn't take that approach early on. I encourage you to take it. They said it's important to capture beginner's mind. Beginner's mind, if you've never heard that term before, it's talking about when we come to a new subject or a new discipline, a new whatever practice we might be learning, that we have an approach to these problems and these concepts that we can't get back. That because we are so fresh and new at this, we have something worthwhile even because of our ignorance. Because we have this brand new way of looking at something, it's something that most people who can't see it brand new anymore, they do value. So while you have beginner's mind, and that phase may last as long as you decide it should. Maybe it's only 1 week that you decide you want to sit with your cards and not know what they really mean, if that's how you feel. You might do like me and have an accidental path of about 5 years of occasional use. I would go through times where I would read more and then I'd put the cards away for 6 months or a year at a time. I wasn't a dedicated reader those first 5 years at all, but I did start having a dialogue with the cards before I had other people's meanings poured into me. And the only meanings I had were the ones in the little white book. And because I began that dialogue, there were certain meanings that I gave my card or cards, images, that later when I studied tarot and I found out that was not actually the intention of the illustrator to give the impression I got from the reading, I thought that was wrong. And so therefore I should wipe out all of my wrong impressions, fill my head with all of the right information, and therefore be a good reader, someone who could do it right. But now I look back and there are only a few moments, only a few cards and images that I can still recall when I was an original reader before I had studied. That's not what the card meant to me. And that's not what the card meant when it came up in a reading. And then later, that kind of got convoluted because I added everybody else's meanings to it. My understanding of the cards themselves grew. And that's an important step as you're growing. But the journaling process is important because you can catch this beginner's mind phase. I also did a lot, if you saw in the other video, I did a lot of my journaling inside the books I was reading. I would write down a lot of my own impressions or things that I would studied or figured out or really took away from the books. So you might even journal inside your books. When I say journal, sometimes people really rebel at the idea of having to sit down and formally pen and paper and write things down. Journaling for you might be a video blog. Maybe you keep your own. So you've got a vlog, or maybe you have a blog. Maybe you just want to put your own impressions in your own place. Maybe you want to put them out there for the world. Maybe they're just for you. But there are other ways to journal. So let's not get too hung up on the idea that it's pencil and paper if that particular medium doesn't speak to you. Okay, so ways you can set up your journal. If you were to work with a paper journal, one way is to set up each page of the journal as being a card. So you would start probably with the major arcanas first and list a page, dedicate a blank page with writing at the top, the Magician, and then flip the page, the High Priestess. And that would be a way for you to then journal impressions, and you can date those impressions along the way if you want to keep track of at what point you had these ideas about the card, which is much more interesting when you look back than when you're writing it down at the time. That's one way you can do it. Like I said, other ways may come to you and may be more natural, especially if the pen and paper isn't working for you. You may also want to put aside an area. So once you've done all the majors, you may continue to put a page per minor. That's 78 pages that you've just dedicated towards a journal that are just going to be for capturing each one of those cards and what it means to you. But let's get into that aspect next. So there's an idea of how to journal and why to journal, what's the importance of journaling, and why does it serve you later as well as in the process of learning. All of that's true. But what I was about to say is when you're first learning tarot, I had it once, there was an analogy a teacher gave me once upon a time. He said it's like walking into a party and meeting 78 people all at the same time. And so when you first meet all 78 of the people who are at your tarot party, you can only kind of remember glimpses and phrases like, oh, she's a mom. Oh, this is a bad boy. This is someone nurturing, works a business person, works in the family. These kind of very brief impressions that we make for people that we meet in an impromptu and overwhelming circumstance like that kind of equivalates to how we relate to our cards early on. We may only have a keyword or two that we kind of think of or that the card may evoke from us as a response. But putting all 78 into your brain all at once, fast, is not the way to learn tarot. And it wasn't until I started learning on the Eclectic Tarot Forum, which is a resource that's no longer out there. In the early 2000s, it was a collection of a lot of not only tarot readers and novices like myself at that time, but also a place for people who had a lot of knowledge, historians, writers, people who had a great deal to offer a community. And through that community, I grabbed a lot of these lessons that I'm giving to anyone who's listening to the Destination Unknown material. So the 78 degrees of wisdom, 78 degrees of people, 78 cards. You've got 78 people that you're introduced to all at once. That's too much. Even if you can begin to kind of catch like, oh yes, the Empress, she's come up several times. She's the mother figure, or she represents nurturing. Those kind of things might stick with us, but we don't really get to know that person at a party like that. We get to know them by future conversations, time we spend one-on-one. And so spending time one-on-one with your cards is how to apply that metaphor. If you do a daily draw, that's one way to put into practice this very concept. So the daily draw is a very well-known way of doing exactly that. It's not something I necessarily keep a habit of still in my life. I've gone through periods where I will daily draw and then I won't. Sometimes it'll be cards. Sometimes I've gone through ruins, periods where for years I would draw a daily ruin, all kinds of different paths like that. And it's a way to Spend that time and have that conversation with that individual without trying to put them into context with all these other information sources around you represented by the other cards. So take the time to start a journal, whatever that journal is. Take the time to then begin to learn your cards. And the way to learn your cards is to begin that dialogue yourself. What colors, what impressions, what mood is in the card is something you might want to look at to journal. Is there a story being told within the card itself? And if so, does the story lead itself to what kind of outcome? Do they look happy? Do they look sad? Do they look regretful? Do they look resigned? All of this kind of material comes to you from your imagination. It's not something you need to go outside yourself to seek, because ultimately, here's what happens. Here's the trap that many metaphysical students get in. They think, I'm going to memorize all 78 meanings for all of these cards. I'm going to have them locked down. And they get there. They have all 78. They know exactly what they mean and what they signify, and what these little symbols even inside their card were created by the illustrator for, but they can't do a reading. It's the weirdest thing in the world. You get to a point where you've been studying for a couple years and all of a sudden you know everything. Yeah, I know tarot, but I don't know how to read. Because the ability to have the cards talk to each other and put a dialogue together, fill those spaces between the card and actually form a narrative, that takes time. And if all you have is a snippet, a piece of information, the equivalent of a key word from a little white book, to try to build this narrative from, it's very frustrating, and it can be very difficult, and to the point where sometimes people get to that point and they quit learning tarot. They kind of go, you know what, I studied it, I'm over it. So this is a way that you can continue your practice. Capture what you've learned right now. And then if you choose, when you choose, it's the right time to begin learning what other people have said about tarot. You have a place that you can continue to build your impressions upon, so that you don't lose those early impressions, but instead they just become more aspects, almost like a diamond has all the different aspects that you can see as it turns, and it's on the turntable, on the ring, they're at the jewelers, and that's so we can see it from every angle. That takes a while. If you think of each one of these cards as a diamond, it's going to take a while to see it from every angle like that and to really appreciate it and what it's trying to say, as well as how it talks to its fellow cards around it. All right. The last thing I would leave you with for today's discussion is, when we're looking at those little white books, it's really easy to go by the advice that's there. It's the only thing you've got to go on usually when you've done your initial purchase of a deck. And they usually almost always show you the Celtic cross as a spread, as if this was the right spread to do, and being the right kind of studious person, I was going to do it right. So of course I followed the book's example, and I would lay out 12 cards or whatever it is, I forget, 12 or 14 cards signifying all these different things. And it would be so difficult, so confusing. So right away, throw out the idea that you have to use the Celtic cross at all, ever, because once I discovered there were so many other spreads. And I do have planned in our lectures for Best Beginning Practices, a lecture coming up on spreads, so we can talk more about that too. But the first thing I have to leave you with is, along with that little white book, if you are stuck in the land of trying to do Celtic cross spreads for yourself and you identify as a beginning reader, stop right now. Less is more. Really begin to understand less is more. You can actually do an entire reading with 3 cards and have it last for half an hour if you're doing it right, if you're really getting in there. More information is not better. Less is more. And so that's where it applies to the daily draw concept. If you just kind of close down all of this concept that I'm going to learn what every card means and just focus on the card that you pull that day, whether it be just from the top of the deck, maybe you shuffle and draw from the center, whatever your process is to get to that daily card, pull it and then journal about it and spend time with it. And that's what's going to really help you have those meaningful conversations. So as your practice continues and you're no longer a beginner, you will have set for yourself the foundations to really be able to understand these images and to work with them in a way that's really yours, authentically yours, because they're your tools. They are your tools. They don't belong to anybody else. So you get to customize them. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today, and appreciate any feedback that you might have as well for any and all of the material here. And one last shout out, I just have to give, look at this. Isn't this beautiful, you guys? This is my awesome jewelry. It came from Desert Moonshine. It says back off 6 feet. Isn't that great for 2020? Okay, so shout out to Desert Moonshine in case you're seeing this awesome jewelry today. Small business shout out. All right. Thank you all. Take care. We'll see you next time.